when Iran's navy announced over open radio channels that the Strait of Hormuz was closed to all shipping. Most people braced for an oil catastrophe. What actually happened was stranger and more interesting than a simple supply collapse. Global oil output fell by roughly 8% in the weeks after closure, yet prices didn't rise by 8%. They rose by something like 60%. That gap between a modest drop in barrels and a massive jump in cost is the real story here. To understand it, we need to look at geography, economics, and the strange psychology of people who trade oil for a living. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the narrowest and most consequential pieces of water on the planet. At its tightest point, it's only a few dozen kilometers wide, with shipping lanes far narrower than that. Roughly a fifth of all oil traded globally passes through this channel, funneled out of the Persian Gulf toward refineries and ports across Asia, Europe, and beyond. When Iran's Revolutionary Guard began threatening and then attacking tankers attempting to pass, the message was simple. Nothing moves without our permission. This is not a new fear. For decades, the countries around the Gulf have understood that their economic lifelines run through a choke point controlled, in part, by a country they don't always get along with. What's notable is how differently prepared each nation was when the threat finally became reality. Some of the smaller Gulf states are almost completely boxed in. Bahrain, despite being smaller than a mid-sized city, still produces enough oil to rank among the world's top 36 producers, though its economy is diversified into banking, refining, and manufacturing. Qatar, similarly, has shifted much of its focus toward liquefied natural gas rather than crude oil. Kuwait, by contrast, remains almost entirely dependent on oil exports, with few other economic pillars to fall back on. What unites these three nations is geography. All of their export routes run directly through Hormuz, with no alternative. When the strait closed, their oil simply had nowhere to go. This was a genuine economic emergency for each of them individually. But in the context of the entire global oil market, their combined output is a relatively small slice of total Gulf production. Their suffering, while real, didn't move global prices nearly as much as you might expect. The bigger producers tell a very different story, because several of them spent years, sometimes decades, building insurance against exactly this scenario. The United Arab Emirates produces several times more oil than Bahrain, Qatar, and Kuwait combined, and crucially, it has a sliver of coastline on the far side of the strait, facing the Gulf of Oman directly. Back in the late 2000s, the UAE built a pipeline connecting its inland oil fields to a port on that outer coastline. Officials at the time talked about cost savings and shorter shipping routes. Few people were fooled. Everyone understood this was about insurance against an Iranian blockade. By the time the war broke out, a meaningful share of Emirati crude was already flowing through this alternate route, which meant the country could keep exporting even with Hormuz effectively sealed. Iran, in a twist that might seem ironic given that it caused the crisis, had built something similar for itself. Most Iranian oil exports flowed through a single island terminal inside the Gulf for years. But Tehran clearly worried that its own enemies might one day try to blockade the strait against it. So it also constructed a secondary export terminal on its southeastern coast, outside the strait entirely. That terminal had barely been used before the war, sitting mostly idle, but it gave Iran a fallback option that could handle a meaningful chunk of its usual export volume once the main route became contested. Iraq's situation is more complicated. Its coastline on the Gulf is tiny, and almost all of its oil loads onto tankers from offshore platforms inside the contested waters. Its one alternative is a pipeline running north through Kurdish territory into Turkey, bypassing both Hormuz and the Suez Canal entirely. On paper, this should be a powerful safety valve. In practice, the pipeline has been unreliable for years because of political disputes between Iraq's central government in Baghdad and the semi-autonomous Kurdish regional government, which has repeatedly used control over the pipeline as a bargaining chip. The closure of Hormuz forced an unusually swift compromise between Baghdad, the Kurdish authorities, and Turkey, reviving a route that had mostly sat dormant. Even so, it could only realistically replace a modest fraction of what Iraq normally ships out through the Gulf. Then there's Saudi Arabia, the heavyweight of the region, which built the most ambitious contingency plan of them all. Unlike its neighbors, Saudi Arabia has access to the Red Sea, and it constructed a pipeline spanning over 1,000 kilometers across the country, connecting its eastern oil fields to a western port. The project dates back to the 1980s, built in the shadow of the Iran-Iraq War, when tanker attacks in the Gulf made Saudi planners nervous about their own vulnerability. The pipeline itself can carry a huge volume of crude, though the rail bottleneck turned out to be the loading capacity at its terminal port. Still, even with that limitation, the kingdom was able to keep exporting enough oil through this route to remain among the largest producers in the world, blockade or no blockade. Add it all up, the UAE's pipeline, Iran's secondary terminal, Iraq's reopened northern route, and Saudi Arabia's cross-country pipeline, and you get a surprising amount of resilience baked into a region that looks, on a map, like it should be completely dependent on one narrow waterway. None of these routes could fully replace what normally flows through Hormuz, but collectively they absorbed a meaningful share of the shock. That's part of the reason the actual physical contraction in global oil supply ended up being smaller than the dramatic headline suggested. This is where the story gets counterintuitive. If supply only fell by something in the neighborhood of 8%, why did prices jump by roughly 7 times that amount? The answer lies in a basic economic concept called the elasticity of demand. Essentially, how sensitive buyers are to a change in price. Some goods are highly elastic. Breakfast cereal is a classic example. If your preferred brand gets more expensive, you'll probably just buy a different one, or switch to oatmeal, or skip breakfast at home altogether. Economists who studied cereal pricing have found that a 10% price increase can cause demand to fall by as much as 30%, because shoppers have so many easy substitutes available. Oil is almost the opposite. There is no quick substitute for gasoline in a car that only runs on gasoline, and there's no substitute for diesel in a freight truck that was built to burn diesel. Most driving isn't optional, either commuting to work, running errands, getting kids to school. Even the portion of driving that is discretionary, like a weekend trip or dinner out, tends not to change much just because gas got more expensive, and personal vehicles only make up a quarter of total oil demand worldwide. The rest goes toward industry, shipping, aviation, and trucking, none of which can simply shrug off higher fuel costs the way a household might cut back on driving. Historical research suggests oil's short-term elasticity of demand is somewhere around negative 0.1, meaning prices would need to rise by roughly 10% just to reduce demand by 1%. Given that framework, an 8% contraction in supply lining up with a 60% price increase isn't actually as wild as it first appears. It implies an elasticity close to what economists already expected from this market, even if it landed slightly more dramatic than the historical average would predict. Some analysts, including senior oil executives, have suggested prices arguably should have settled somewhere lower than where they actually landed, which raises the obvious question. If the math roughly works out, why did the market seem overshoot even by its own logic? Markets aren't just mechanical reflections of supply and demand. They're driven by people, specifically commodity traders who spend their careers trying to guess what oil prices will do next, and then placing enormous financial bets on those guesses. Crucially, these traders don't just react to current conditions. They react to expectations about future conditions. And they do so using a mix of physical oil purchases and financial instruments like futures contracts. This creates a feedback loop. If enough traders believe prices are about to rise, they start buying up oil and contracts in anticipation, which itself pushes prices higher before any change in actual physical supply has occurred. The expectation becomes the cause. In a market like this, what matters day to day isn't just the underlying barrels. It's a prevailing narrative about where things are headed. That narrative effect explains something odd about the opening days of this conflict. The initial strikes happened over a weekend, giving traders 2 full days to digest the news before markets even opened. Yet when trading resumed, prices rose by a relatively modest amount, nowhere near what you'd expect from the closure of the single most important oil choke point on Earth. The following days saw further modest increases, and at one point the market was essentially flat even as reports of drone strikes on tankers kept coming in. Why such a muted initial reaction to such a dramatic event? Because many traders genuinely believed, at least at first, that the conflict would stay limited and short. Official statements from the administration framed the strikes as a narrow, targeted operation rather than the opening move of a broader war. Given the political unpopularity of prolonged conflicts and a recent track record of contained military operations elsewhere, traders largely took these assurances at face value. The market priced in a quick resolution, not a prolonged blockade. Then reality caught up with expectation, and it happened through an unglamorous but critical mechanism: marine insurance. The moment Iranian forces began actively striking vessels, the world's major maritime insurers issued near simultaneous notices canceling war risk coverage for ships operating anywhere near the Gulf. This matters enormously because the ships and cargo involved are worth staggering sums. A single large crude tanker could be worth well over $100 million, and its cargo could be worth just as much again. No shipping company is going to send a vessel that valuable into a war zone without insurance, and a panel of major insurers, which periodically classifies global regions by risk, had already flagged Gulf waters as dangerous territory requiring special coverage. That coverage can be pulled with just a few days' notice, and that's exactly what happened across the industry almost simultaneously once the fighting started. Even after some insurers began offering policies again in the following weeks, the terms had changed dramatically. Premiums for war risk coverage reportedly increased by more than tenfold compared to pre-war rates. So even where the physical waterway might have technically permitted travel, the financial reality made transiting it prohibitively expensive for many shipping companies. This bureaucratic and financial freeze, arguably more than the missiles themselves, was what finally convinced traders that this wasn't going to be a brief, contained skirmish. Prices accelerated sharply from that point forward, even as some of the alternative pipeline routes started ramping up to compensate. As the weeks passed and the rerouted pipelines absorbed more of the law supply, you might expect prices to have eased back toward pre-war levels. To some extent, prices did stabilize, but they settled at a level still far above where they started, hovering near triple-digit territory for an extended stretch. Every bit of supply that came back online through alternate routes seemed to be offset by growing anxiety about how long this disruption might actually last. Part of what's being repriced here isn't just the immediate supply gap. It's a broader reassessment of how stable the entire Gulf region really is. For years, as these oil-producing nations grew wealthier and more globally integrated, there was a comfortable assumption that their economic importance somehow insulated them from the instability surrounding them. This war shattered that assumption. A single country demonstrated it could choke off a fifth of the world's oil supply almost overnight, using little more than coastal missile batteries, drones, and a radio broadcast. That kind of demonstrated capability doesn't just disappear once a ceasefire is signed. Markets tend to price in the possibility of future disruption for a long time after the immediate crisis fades, because the underlying vulnerability, a narrow strait controlled in part by a hostile actor, hasn't gone away. Until global oil logistics genuinely reduce their dependence on the Strait of Hormuz through further pipeline expansion, alternative trade routes, or a long-term reduction in oil demand itself. This episode suggests the world should expect a persistent risk premium baked into the price of every barrel, and by extension, into the price everyone pays at the pump. What this war revealed wasn't just a story about Iran, oil tankers, and a narrow stretch of water. It was a demonstration of how fragile global energy markets remain despite decades of supposed diversification and contingency planning. Pipelines and alternate ports helped. Without them, the price spike would likely have been far worse, but they could only ever be partial solutions to a problem rooted in geography. As long as so much of the world's oil has to pass through a handful of narrow choke points, a single determined actor will retain an outsized ability to disrupt the global economy. The events of this war didn't just spike prices for a few weeks. They reset how the market thinks about risk in the region for years to come.